I am Melissa Cry, and I am a PhD student. I'm in my last year, so that means I'm up for looking for postdocs and other opportunities. If there's any vacancies, let me know. My chair is Damian Adams, and he's the Natural Resource Policy and Economics Professor, Assistant Professor, Associate Professor at School of Forest Resources and Conservation at the University of Florida, also known as the Gator Nation, which is why I assume I am under this section called National Issues. Actually, I don't know why I'm in that section, but and I have a lot of supporters, as you see down below. Some names you may be familiar with and some not so much, but I do have a lot of supporters behind my research. So, as many of us know, forest ecosystems are very important for protecting water resources, and according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, they combined some ecosystem service topic areas, supporting services, provisioning services, regulating and cultural services that bring use and non-use benefits to humans. And you can see this lovely list here. So this is the kind of stuff I'm interested in. What are these benefits to humans, and how do we value that? And connecting that to decision making, management decisions, policies, there's kind of a flow-through chart. You start with the structure and function of these ecosystems, and that results in particular services and goods, and these services and goods provide benefits, and these benefits can be valued in economic and monetary terms. At least that's what we try and do, and then those values can be used to inform policies and management plans that can be used to modify up at the top the function and structures of these systems. So there is a need to estimate the value of protecting water quality. This is a figure from the U.S. Forest Service, and it is basically showing the potential for changes in water quality as a result of an increase in housing density on private forest lands. So we're talking about a shift away from forest lands to being non-forested, non-forest uses, and the potential impact on water quality. So getting started on the whole water quality valuation question, I started my dissertation with a meta-analysis, and that is basically I looked at a bunch of willingness to pay valuation studies that asked, they were from all over the country, and they asked the respondents, how much are you willing to pay to protect water quality in systems that are unpolluted? And we found that people are willing to pay increasingly more each year to protect clean water. Another way of saying that is that people over the last 25 years have been willing to contribute a larger percentage of their income towards protecting clean water, and this likely has to do with an increase in population and demand for clean water. Also, people were more interested in programs that were located within their watershed and their basin. So people want to see that these programs benefit them directly. Another important finding, and this variable had the largest explanatory power in the model, was that there was a difference in willingness to pay when it was stated that programs would use land acquisition or conservation easements versus non-specific programs. These are some willingness to pay values estimated using our model. We conducted a benefit transfer of willingness to pay values to the lower Swanee River watershed, and we found that when the studies were not specific about how water would be protected, the process that would be used, that willingness to pay was much, much different when they stated what the process would be. In this case, it would be land acquisition or easement. So I decided to follow this rabbit trail and find out a little bit more about how the process behind protecting water quality and conserving forests influences people's willingness to pay and the utility associated with these programs. So I conducted a statewide web survey, and my objective was to estimate utility associated with both program outcome and how the program was designed. So I looked at different attributes related to those characteristics. I also estimated willingness to pay for these programs, and I wanted to look at some different values and attitudes associated with these program attributes and use that to explain a little bit more about maybe why they chose to have a higher utility or lower utility with some program attributes. So in developing the survey, I identified 20 important program attributes through literature review and professional consultation, and I developed 16 scenarios or hypothetical programs, and I used a main effects orthogonal array so that every attribute, the respondent can compare every attribute with another attribute, and so they go compare them all. We also included attitude scales and demographic questions. I'll get more into that in a little bit. I did a pilot survey, and then I executed it using SurveyMonkey, which is a consultant survey company. So the people that responded to the survey, they're completely anonymous. I had nothing to do with tracking down any of them, and or influence on who responded and how. So the program attributes can be explained as there's the core attributes or the attribute categories, and these categories were part of program design. I looked at how the program would be implemented, and the attribute levels included purchasing private land or land acquisition, conservation easement, education and outreach to private landowners to manage their land more effectively to protect water quality, and financial assistance to landowners, kind of the concept of ecosystem service payments, and then also who would implement it, and I have federal, state agencies, county organization, and private nonprofit organizations. There's also the outcome benefits I was interested in. Use benefits included recreation, groundwater recharge, commercial fisheries, and storm protection. And the non-use benefits were ensuring clean water in the future, which is option value, ensuring that all people benefit, which is altruistic value, passing along to grandchildren is bequest value, and maintaining an polluted ecosystem is existence value. And along with all these, I had a proposed monthly utility tax ranging from 50 cents a month to $5. I chose a utility tax because that seemed to be the least biased way of asking people what they're willing to pay, as opposed to like a sales tax or some other kind of tax, which may be selective in who would be paying the price. And I wanted to remove that from the equation when people reported what they were willing to pay. So I used a new methodology, new to the natural resource field anyway. It's been used in other fields, but it's called best-worst choice, and it is a combination of dichotomous choice and best-worst scaling. Dichotomous choice estimates utility based on a stated willingness to pay, and we'll see that a little bit more coming up. And the best-worst scale is measuring utility based on stated preferences. And also, it can capture the utility associated with those attribute categories as well as those individual attribute levels. And this is an improvement over dichotomous choice. Together, though, we can have a better understanding of the relationship between utility and willingness to pay, which is important because it's often assumed that utility and willingness to pay are correlated. Here's an example question. I asked, which aspect of the, below is a description of a water quality protection program, and there are an attribute from each one of the categories. And I asked them which attribute they most preferred and least preferred, and that was the best-worst scale, the best attribute, the worst attribute. And then, would you vote to accept this program? And that is the dichotomous choice question. I also asked them a little bit about their attitudes and values towards forest, and I had a couple of scales. I had a forest values scale, and it's based on the new ecological paradigm, and that basically measured if they had more anthropocentric values versus biocentric values. Anthropocentric values tend to perceive forests as being valuable as long as it benefits humans, whereas biocentric values perceive the value of forest as being intrinsic. And I also had a trust in government scale, and I asked them to rate their level of trust in government organizations that use forests to protect water quality. So who responded? I had about 557 responses, and that is a number that is large enough to statistically justify representing the population in Florida. Most of them were basically not landowners. I wanted to be sure that I wasn't having too many people that were landowners in the survey, and so we can say that they're not going to be too terribly biased by owning land. 40% lived in Florida more than 20 years, long-term residents, people who don't know much about Florida. There is a large influx of people coming into Florida, so there may be a difference in opinion if you've only lived there a few years versus if you'd lived there much longer. And a little over half lived in an urban area, which is about greater than 1,000 people per square mile. A little about half, 50-50, male, female. You can see responses by zip code as it's distributed out pretty well too. And age and income were both representative of distributions in Florida. So our attitude and values results, we found with trust in government, most people had a moderate level of trust. And in forest values, people tended to be more biocentric. So for the dichotomous choice results, I used a random effects logistic regression to estimate the probability of voting yes for a program. And you can see with willingness to pay, those attributes, if you see a positive coefficient, then they were more likely to vote yes, where if there was a negative coefficient, they're more likely to vote no. So there was more favorable for the lower willingness to pay values. The option benefit was found to be more favorable, or they were more likely to vote yes. If we go down, that's under non-use benefits, whereas the altruistic benefits, they were more likely to vote no. If we go to use benefits, groundwater recharge was associated with a higher likelihood of voting no. Under conservation tool, which is the process used to bring land into conservation, there was a positive association with conservation easement, but there was a negative one associated with outreach and education to landowners. Under implementing organization, a nonprofit was more higher probability voting yes, versus a county government was more likely to vote no. People with a higher education were more likely to vote yes. People with more biocentric forest values were more likely to vote yes. Higher trust in government also associated with voting yes. Whew. So here's another very large table, and this is the best-worst scale. And the concept here is that we'll just look at the top one. I have much better figures for you to look at. These core attributes, but you see that the level of utility was associated the highest with non-use benefits, going to use benefits, how the land was conserved, the tax payment, and then who implemented it. So let's compare these two, and I'll get into the more details of the results of the other table in this discussion. So comparing the model results, we find that there was general agreement that people placed a high value on programs that preserve future options and that were run by a nonprofit and had the lowest level of tax. And they also had a low value associated with protecting groundwater recharge. There was a moderate agreement with conservation easements. They were willing to vote yes, even though it provided a moderate level of utility. And there was also an interesting result where there was a high level of utility associated with outreach and education of private landowners, but they were more likely to vote no in supporting to pay for those types of programs. So what does this look like under policy options? And you see here, if we're going to, the policy objective is to increase social welfare and the probability of a favorable vote, if this is based on voting, then these attributes here were generally had a low level of satisfaction and people were less likely to vote for it. And they were similar to what I pointed out earlier, protecting groundwater recharge or providing for groundwater recharge, programs implemented by the county, programs that were altruistic, perhaps they distributed the benefits too thinly because they were very broad, and then the higher levels of utility tax. There was a moderate level of satisfaction with land acquisition and conservation easements in the middle level of utility tax, and there was a high preference for programs that protected future options, were implemented by nonprofit groups, and provided recreation, and had the lowest level of utility tax. And then over here we see that there's a high level of satisfaction associated with education for and outreach to landowners, but the probability of voting yes was low. So in summary, annual household willingness to pay was around $6 to $12 annually, or 43 to 86 million annually statewide in Florida. And there was systematic variation in utility associated with both the program outcomes as well as the design attributes. But this variation utility did not always correlate with willingness to pay. And also, looking at the attitudes and demographics, people who had a high trust in government and more biocentric values had a higher willing to pay, and people with higher level of education had a higher willingness to pay. So, some conclusions. How a program is designed can influence public support, and certain program implementation strategies may not be utility neutral, and researchers and policymakers should recognize the potential consequences of ignoring preferences for program design when creating policies for welfare analysis or conducting benefit transfer. So the process does matter about how you conserve these forests as far as public preferences. And public support may not always be in the form of willingness to pay. Just because a respondent decides that they don't want to pay for a good doesn't mean the respondent doesn't have preferences about that good. And I can agree with that. I have a lot of preferences for, huge mansions that I will never buy. And policies concerned with promoting social welfare should consider looking at preferences not captured by willingness to pay estimates. And looking at the respondents and government, even though most respondents had a moderate level of trust in government, there appeared to be a high preference for programs run by nonprofits and that educated landowners. And this seems to be keeping land more in the private sector than in the government sector. Respondents also associated a high level of utility with programs that supported recreation, and this may be because they connect recreation to benefits perceived as being directly towards them, as compared to something like groundwater recharge, which has more dispersed benefits. And respondents were more likely to vote no for programs that ensured everyone benefited. That was the altruistic attribute. And this may be that, once again, the benefits would be spread too thin, as opposed to a program that had more targeted beneficiaries. And people are also more likely to vote no for programs that educated landowners, and this may be that they again perceived that these types of programs would benefit the landowners before it benefited them, or some other kinds of perceptions that would deserve further explanation. But I have decided in my future work to go ahead and validate the results of this hypothetical survey, and I will be doing that by assessing voter behavior on county level referendums in Florida. And these are referendums usually to raise funds to protect water quality in forest lands. And I'll be looking at characteristics of the referendums, some similar characteristics such as how will the program be implemented. And since I can't know anything about the voter, I'll be looking at county demographics. And I'll also be looking at external forces such as characteristics of the county, as far as what industries are going on there, what kind of resources are available, as well as the presentation of these resources at the time of the election. And that is what I'm currently working on now. And thank you to my many supporters and to my chair. I'll take questions at this time if we have time.
We have plenty of time here for questions. Questions from Melissa? Yes.
Just wonder if you had any information on the correlation of willingness to pay questions versus the response when they're actually required to pay.
Willingness to pay tends to be, he asked if there is a correlation between this hypothetical questioning of willingness to pay versus what do people actually pay, and willingness to pay is usually inflated. That actual behaviors tend to be they'll pay less or they won't pay.
Yes, sir.
You say that you're unlikely to have a higher percent of people saying no if it's a government-run program. Do you expect your further analysis with government-run referendums to show you a similar result?
Well, the referendums are not exactly the best vehicle to help me, answer that question. Some of the referendums do state who would be conducting the program, and some are non-specific. For example, they'll say this bond is going to raise funds for this county's environmental program to do these designated actions. Or they'll say this bond is to raise funds to have these certain outcomes, but then they don't state would they just give the money out as a grant to some private nonprofit, or how that would be disseminated. So there is a way to get around that, but it's not as well teased out usually as it would be.
It's probably going to be a function of how much they're asking for.
I don't know the answer to that one. I'm interested to know if the intended amount of money raised has anything to do with decision-making process by the voter. I'm unfamiliar with that.
Yes.
Many of you may not know, because you're not from Florida, but she's answered a very important question right away, because state government and the water management districts usually promote the recharge of groundwater as the way to get people to participate in water conservation. And her research has pointed out that that's totally the wrong way to go. So that's very important. Thank you very much for that.
Yes, sir.
Since you don't know anything about the respondents to your survey, how do you know that your results are indicative of the population that you're really trying to say something about?
Yes.
Maybe you captured more educated people, or...
Well, that's exactly what my committee was very concerned about. So what I did was I asked SurveyMonkey, the third-party survey group, that I needed a certain percentage of the age distribution of age, income, and gender that represented the last 2010 census. So that, because I know Florida has a certain category of demographics, and I wanted to make sure I represented Florida and not just whoever would answer the survey. Now, when it comes to survey issues, there is a bias towards that this was a web survey, so I didn't get to capture people that are not online. And I don't know what the implications are that for my results.
Yes.
I was wondering if in your survey, if you gave the respondents the opportunity to kind of opt out of any program, like you gave them these options to pick, programs with attributes A versus program with attributes B.
Mm-hmm.
Could they say, I don't want any program at all?
Yes, they could. They could vote no. Down at the bottom. And they were able to opt out. And frequently people did. There were some people that voted one time out of 16 scenarios.
Other
Do
questions?
you have that percent?
No, I don't. That would be an interesting one, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Larry?
On one of your graphics, you said that they preferred flexibility and something like that.
Let's go to, this is the one with all the significant results
It was
included.
actually a chart where you
Okay.
characterized the good and the bad.
Oh. Are you,
Near the end of the graph.
okay.
Yeah, protects future options.
Yeah.
How was the future option distinguished from conservation easements? I mean, do they feel like they're locked in with conservation easements?
Well, yes, there was a distinguishment between that. One, protecting future options was more of a, being a non-use benefit, was just a concept that might be a driver behind a decision. And it is and conservation easements are in perpetuity, and the concept is that it protects future. Well, it doesn't give you an option to use it necessarily in the future. But that was more of an implementation attribute. So I was more interested in that as far as how the program was implemented, and then this was supposed to represent more of a, what do you want out of a program in general, and overall people wanted to protect future options. I hope that clarifies it a little bit.
Well, let's give Melissa a nice hand and thank her.
Thank you.
Here, let me